want to start off by talking about CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Now, for those who are not familiar with CHAZ, um, it is essentially a few hundred protesters gathering and quarantining off like a 6 block area of downtown Seattle known as Capitol Hill. Um, and they basically cordoned it off around the East Precinct Police Department of the Seattle Police Department, um, essentially using it as a demonstration and protest of the police and essentially gathering in the wake of the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Essentially, what has happened is you have an area in which people who are essentially radical leftists, a bunch of hippies, uh, communing, like essentially forming a commune um, in the middle of Seattle to sort of let their voices be heard. It's been a weird week. It's been a very weird year, but let's get through some of the misinformation surrounding this because there's some information coming in that sounds like these are domestic terrorists and they are essentially Antifa terrorists. I have no idea if they are actually terrorists. I know that a few of them are armed to defend themselves. They're certainly not unarmed, and it's maybe conflating peaceful protesters with, say, something a little bit that's, I wouldn't say violent. They're certainly not violent because it's not destroying everything, but um, I guess they're just lawless. It's civil disobedience. Probably civil disobedience to the extreme. That's probably the best way of characterizing what CHAZ is. It's civil disobedience to the extreme. The furthest you could possibly go without actually hurting or killing anyone. Because some of the reports coming out is that they're not actually destroying buildings, they're not destroying property. There's still a lot of business owners who are operating in that 6 block radius, and they've at least told reporters that business has been fine. They've actually been getting a lot of walk-ins. But at the same time, they have to look at the actions of the local government. Mayor Jenny Durkin, who has essentially given these protesters a pass. She posted a long thread this week on Thursday, essentially pointing to the fact that she's going to let this protest continue because Orange Man bad, because she hates Trump. I mean, pretty much her entire thread is addressed to Trump, who, by the way, has essentially said that the federal authorities are going to come in and clean the whole thing up. I don't think it's going to end the way that these protesters are going to want. And the reason for that is because they have published a list of demands saying that only when those demands are met, that's when they're going to basically vacate that 6 block area, or CHAZ. I'm just going to read off some of the demands. The first demand is the Seattle Police Department and attached court system are beyond reform. We do not request reform. We demand abolition. So abolishing the police and all the court systems that exist in Seattle, they want those gone. Number two, in the transitionary period between now and the dismantlement of the Seattle Police Department, we demand that the use of armed force be banned entirely. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure what that means. I guess they're addressing the police department and disarming them. Number three, we demand an end to the school to prison pipeline and the abolition of youth jails. Get kids out of prison, get cops out of schools. Number four, we demand that not the city government nor the state government, but the federal government launch a full-scale investigation into past and current cases of police brutality in Seattle and Washington, as well as the reopening of all closed cases reported to the Office of Police Accountability. They also posted 15 other demands about how the loosely organized group would like government to operate in the city moving forward. Interestingly enough, that point on number 4 is that they want the federal government to come in and investigate instances of police brutality. You're never going to get that. Essentially, you're especially not going to get it with President Trump sort of being the executive of the federal government. And it's I don't know what realistic demands they are trying to make here, because none of them are going to be met. But Jenny Durkin, the mayor of Seattle, in one of her tweets, she wrote, "The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, CHAZ, is not a lawless wasteland of anarchist insurrection. It is a peaceful expression of our community's collective grief and their desire to build a better world. Given his track record, it's not hard to believe that Trump is wrong yet again." Okay, after reading that, there is at least some truth to Mayor Durkin's tweet. It is not a wasteland, but it is certainly civil disobedience. It is a lawless area, and there have been reported crimes happening, robberies, rapes, theft, and the police are not allowed to go in. And Mayor Durkin has essentially given a stand-down order to Seattle police to vacate that East Precinct. Now, I don't understand how feckless a leader you have to be to essentially not enforce the rule of law, because she outlawed the use of CS gas, otherwise known as tear gas, and the Seattle police chief used it in that particular area after the ban. It was a ban for 30 days, and the Seattle police chief used tear gas in that particular precinct where CHAZ is established, because the police chief thought there was going to be violence in that particular area. Now the police precinct in CHAZ has been boarded up, and I've only seen video of like 2 cops going into that precinct, I guess to check on it. I don't know exactly what else they've been doing. But the protesters in CHAZ want to essentially turn that police precinct into like a community center. And when you think about it, yes, this isn't as bad as, say, terrorists actually taking over, a city and threatening demands and, taking hostages. This is several grades below that, not nearly as extreme. But at the same time, it invites other groups, and it probably inspires other groups to engage in the same form of civil disobedience and lawlessness, and you could see it happen or spread to other cities. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I have no idea, because we don't know where this will end. So far, not many people have been hurt. I'm sure there have been some people injured. There have been people reportedly raped in this case and have had their things stolen from them. Obviously, those aren't good by any stretch of the means. And I think it's the most striking aspect of it is, where's the level of coverage for a group that takes over 6-block radius of a city? Say if it were a right-wing group taking over, say, downtown Austin, Texas, which is a huge liberal hub in a very red state, which, by the way, is probably shifting demographics. The media would probably go batshit. They would cover this end to end, 24/7, because if they had guns, for a fact that it probably would catch a lot of heat. That being said, we do recall in 2016, you had the Bundy family taking over a federal outpost in Oregon. And at the time, I don't think it actually got a whole lot of coverage, but it certainly got more coverage than, say, maybe CHAZ. Kind of hard to compare the two, because the federal outpost that the Bundy family basically took over was abandoned or largely abandoned. It was in the middle of nowhere. And I think a lot of people looked at it and said, oh, they're having this dispute with the Bureau of Land Management. We'll just see how it goes. Ended up with actually one of the members of the Bundy family dying in an FBI shootout. And the members who were involved in the takeover essentially had their case dropped by the DOJ. So I guess it is comparing a bit of apples to oranges right there, and maybe not the best comparison because the two cases are just so different. Other than that, when we look at CHAZ, I mean, in many ways you have to laugh. However, there are many groups that would probably chomp at the bit to take over a police precinct or a 6 block radius of a city or even more, or have a full on takeover to essentially impose whatever demands they want. And to see the type of leadership from Mayor Jenny Durkin is honestly, it's I wouldn't say it's disappointing. It's not certainly not surprising, but it is in many ways sort of the direction that radical leftists would like to head in, and that is one that lawlessness is more or less a virtue to be achieved and not essentially something that people should discourage. Look, at the end of the day, when we look at this particular CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, civil disobedience is certainly something that, Americans do all the time. Protesting is a constitutional right, the right to assemble. But when you are certainly taking and commandeering your own territory and claiming it as your own, say from the local government, you are inviting other groups to say, maybe the ones that are more nefarious, to say take their own action and possibly get more violent. I'm not saying that the Seattle CHAZ is the worst thing I've ever seen, but it could be a snowball effect where you see more of this happening and people's lives could be in danger.